tested my voice.
Uh, yeah, they've got.
How about the people in here? Can they hear me well?
Yeah.
Hey, excellent.
So, we're also live streaming this, which is why then we have to awkwardly wait. But it's great. There's a live studio audience. You're the lucky ones.
So we don't have to do the canned laughter?
Well, no, because we'll make funny jokes and then they'll just do it.
Oh,
Okay, I'm just talking to Jim, I'm going to go 30 seconds. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, depending on where you're watching this from, for the online audience. For the audience here in person, good evening. Welcome to tonight's Ford Evening Book Club. My name is Chris Schultz. I'm director of the programs here at Washington Vernon. We would like to, as I said, Ford Evening Book Talk, especially thank the donors for this book talk, the Ford Motor Company. If you don't own a Ford, maybe go buy one. For the folks online, you'll be less sort of help with this, but for all of you here, I'd like to introduce you and eventually ask you to give a resounding Mount Vernon welcome to our author, Craig Chapman. Mr. Chapman is not only, Mr. Chapman is not your typical actor.
Right? Very patient.
Yeah, just so excited. You just feel the energy in the room. Mr. Chapman is not sort of a traditional academic historian in the highfalutin sense that some folks get snotty about. He has had a long and varied career, which I think can make someone a better author than some of the alternative. He's worked in a variety of roles, including network sales specialist, project manager, Army officer, historian, and now author. He is the graduate of the University of Wisconsin.
Go Badgers.
Yeah, go Badgers. Yeah, because there's like places like Stout and stuff, but they're probably not watching. Go Badgers. His focus is on military history. It's a natural outgrowth of his 28 years as an infantry officer in the U.S. Army and National Guard, where he served from platoon leader all the way up to battalion commander. And those duties provided a keen insight into doctrine and tactics that help him appraise combat actions of past conflicts, which brings us to tonight. But it's not just the War of Jenkins' Ear that Mr. Chapman has researched. He's also been the author of a number of other books, including Battle-Hardened and Infantry Officer's Harrowing Journey from V-Day to VE Day, as well as More Terrible Than Victory, North Carolina's Bloody Bethel Regiment, 1861 to 1865. He lives in Raleigh, North Carolina with his wife, Mary Ann, who's also joining us here tonight, which is really the most important person. And they are the parents of 3 adult children. I do always love when people specify the adult children, whether that's meant as a slight or. But I like that you've done the 3 big wars of U.S. history: World War II, the Civil War, and the War of Jenkins.
By accident.
Yeah,
it worked out that way.
You all didn't realize that, but it is. He is here tonight to talk about his new book that I forgot to bring up with me, but Disaster. We have plenty of copies outside.
There you go.
So doesn't matter about my copy. It's about getting your copy. Disaster on the Spanish Main, the tragic British-American expedition to the West Indies during the War of Jenkins' Ear. Please help me welcome our author, Craig Chapman, to Mount Vernon.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
So I've done enough talking for a bit, but I do need to ask, because
Please,
I need
go
to
right
tee it
ahead.
up for you to do more. But I always find it fascinating. One of the things I always try to ask any author we're dealing with, or I'm interviewing, is because I always find this such an interesting process. What led you to doing this book? Because all jokes aside, the War of Jenkins' Ear is not exactly terribly well known. So what led you to doing this project?
Well, this goes back to my grade school days. I happened to find a history book, opened it up, and there was a picture of the fortress there at Cartagena de Indias, with an explanation that colonial soldiers had fought there. And I imagine, like many of you, seeing a caption like that, well, why would American colonists be fighting in South America? And that always stuck with me. So over the years, I became aware of the War of Jenkins' Ear. And as I looked into it more and more, I realized that this was not just a small, little, obscure war. This was the British Army and Navy's biggest overseas expedition up to that time. It was a massive campaign launched against the Spanish Empire. And the fact that it dragged 4,000 Americans down to the coast of South America just made it so much more interesting that the more I got into it, the more I became fascinated with it. And it's really an outgrowth of that little curiosity from way back when. And the more I read about it, the more I learned about it, the more fascinated I became until I had to write about it.
Well, I think one of the most fascinating things about the War of Jenkins' Ear is the title or the name, right? Like you don't normally hear wars named after people's body parts.
It wasn't a contemporary
Yeah,
name.
yeah, yeah,
It
yeah.
was coined in the
Yeah.
19th century, but yes.
But so sort of to that, what is, because this is one of the American conflicts that we don't hear about as much. What is sort of the background to the conflict?
Well, this is a unusual war in that it was a popular war. This was not a war of dynasties or kingdoms fighting each other. This one was driven a lot by mercantile interest in the Spanish West Indies after the War of the Spanish Succession, or what we call Queen Anne's War here in the colonies. British trading interest expanded into the Spanish West Indies as per the treaty, but it was accompanied by a vast amount of smuggling and illicit trade, violating Spain's trade monopoly that it tried to maintain over its possessions in the West Indies. Eventually, they sent out what they called their guardacostas, privateers, to try and suppress the smuggling, which led to a lot of resentment from British sea captains who were being stopped, raided, plundered, their ships condemned, whether they were selling illicit cargoes or not. And that mounted pressure within Britain, saying, why are we having our merchants stopped on the seas when we have the most powerful navy in the world? Eventually, politically, it became imperative to do something about it, and they were unable to reach an agreement with the Spanish king, and the government of Sir Robert Walpole eventually had to concede, well, we can't solve this diplomatically. We'll have to do it militarily.
Well, and I like the point that you make. Part of what you just made, and one of the things I thought you did such a fascinating job of sort of unpacking in your book, is that the difference between this war and some of the other sort of, I don't know if you're all familiar with it, but sort of the cabinet wars of the 18th century, that they're very much over these sort of bespoke dynastic issues of who's Habsburg's second cousin married which, Bourbon's fourth cousin. Whereas here, I mean, and I don't remember the gentleman's name, but there's the one Spanish Guardacosta officer that's, one seems to show up everywhere. Seems to be a not great person just in general, and becomes sort of a
nuisance,
a nuisance, and sort of a popular figure within the British press as it's sort of drumming up.
Well, the Guardacostas committed some pretty heinous acts, and one of which was a sea captain named Jenkins was stopped and had his ear cut off in the process of his ship being plundered by Guardacostas, very similar to the gentleman that you mentioned, Jose Campuzano Polanco, who was a Guardacosta who later became pretty directly involved in the fighting around Cartagena during the actual campaign to the West Indies.
If I remember correctly, like the ear even ends up in Parliament at one point, does it? Like sort of getting waved around, or at least what's alleged to be the ear?
There was a resolution passed in Parliament to have Captain Jenkins come to Parliament to present his ear. There is no known historical record to say whether or not he actually showed up with his severed ear.
But it made great precedent. Yeah. I always joke with folks, like, you think British Parliament's kind of crazy, but you've never seen crazy of, dismembered body parts being waved around British So it's kind of
Yeah.
disappointing that it may not have actually happened. I'm sad to learn that the British press may have lied to me in the 18th century.
Oh, it was made sensational news, and that was part of the popular pressure to
And
get
part of
this.
the point.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Well, and I think one of the other things that your book does a great job of sort of unpacking is that this isn't. I think you'll hopefully see where I'm going with this. That this isn't the later wars that we're used to hearing about. That this is a British government and British ministry still sort of, and frankly, British Army and Navy still trying to figure out how to project this newfound power that it has. That it's sort of it has in theory, but it hasn't quite learned how to apply it yet.
Well, it had been 25 years since the British Army had an active military campaign when they were tasked to go overseas and capture one of the critical ports used by the Spanish treasure fleets, Havana, Cartagena, or Veracruz. So after 25 years, let's just say the British Army had forgotten a few things about how to fight. British Navy had been very active, but it was still on a peacetime footing. And all the bureaucracies in London had to retool for this massive military expedition. It ended up that there were like 35 to 40 ships of the line of the British Navy at Cartagena, which I calculated was 40% of the capital ships of the British Navy were sitting in Cartagena during this campaign. And I think it was like 30% of the British Army was in Cartagena. And if you think about the commitments of the British Empire at the time, that was a huge investment. But to launch an expedition like that, you have to transport the troops, which means you have to get a lot of ships to carry a lot of soldiers. You have to equip them. You have to feed them. You have to feed them in the West Indies, which meant a year's worth of meat packing had to be done with salted beef and salted pork. And the end result was a tremendous suffering from scurvy during the campaign because they just didn't understand how to support a force at such a distance. And then the fact that it was being fought in the tropics added another layer of difficulty in that the British were not accustomed to dealing with tropical diseases such as yellow fever and malaria, and compounded by the effects of dysentery and scurvy because of the difficulty of projecting a force at such distance. And I do like to contrast the campaign of 1741 and 42 ended terribly for the British. But in 1762, with 6 months' notice, the British projected a force to Havana and captured Havana with all the same difficulties that this expedition suffered. But in Havana, they were highly successful. They captured Havana, which was a much more difficult target than Cartagena. And it was just an indication that at this time, the British just didn't quite have the wherewithal, the understanding of how to pull off such a complex military expedition.
Well, and this is where the Americans start to come in, because, as I understand it, one of the ways the British will float an idea of how to maybe ease the supply situation is to, well, why bring Europeans to the Americas to fight in the Americas when we could just have Americans fight in the Americas? And they're also sort of us, so we'll have them go down to the tropics. So how did that sort of process play out?
The problem that the British had was when they decided to go to war in the summer of 1739, they still had the Army on a peacetime footing, and the Navy was still on a peacetime footing. The king didn't help matters when he said that only 2 regiments from the British Army could go to this West Indies expedition. The rest would have to be made up with new regiments. So the British High Command spent 6 months just trying to figure out, well, how do we do this? They couldn't agree on what to do. Finally, they dug up a letter that was in the files from a dozen years earlier, submitted by Alexander Spotswood. Now, has anybody heard of Alexander Spotswood? Governor of
Do you have a
Virginia.
audience? Come on.
Back
1,000 bonus points.
back in 1727, he had floated this idea. You know what? If you want to have somebody fight in the Spanish West Indies, you could use American colonists. And up to the time, the British Army had pretty much dismissed the idea of using provincials. They just didn't think that provincials could serve in the British Army. Too ill-disciplined, too free-spirited. And plus the fact that wages in America were higher than England. So there weren't enough financially desperate young men to sign up if you're in America. But Spotswood made an interesting suggestion. He said, if the Americans can serve under a local company commander rather than a British regular army officer, that they could get about 3,000 to sign up. Well, at the time, when they read this letter, this old letter, the idea of getting 3,000 recruits from someplace they had never even thought of just really excited the high command. The king even made a comment about, well, why not? Why don't we have soldiers from every part of our kingdom contribute to the cause in proportion to their size? And the admiral, chief of the First Lord of the Admiralty, thought, well, it's a great idea. Get Americans to serve in the Spanish West Indies because they're already acclimated to the Caribbean climate. So people coming from New York,
because New York's totally
coming from Massachusetts and New York, they're already good to go to fight in Cartagena. So they jumped on this idea. The king offered very generous terms. Whoever agreed to sign up a company of soldiers would get a regular army commission. The soldiers themselves did not have to sign up for life. They only had to serve for the duration of the campaign. They got the same pay as British regulars. They got a free uniform and they got a free musket. And the last little term was that because they were designated as a Marine regiment, they were entitled to share in the plunder expected to be taken from whatever they captured in the Spanish West Indies, which provided a little extra inducement. And sure enough,
performance bonuses.
Exactly. And the suggestion worked. Americans signed up more than they thought they could get. Over 4,000 had signed up. And in fact, they had a problem because they only sent enough commissions for 3,000 soldiers in 30 companies. It turns out that we had over 4,000. So the state or the colony of Massachusetts actually dismissed 500 volunteers because, well, if we're not going to get commissions, we're sure not going to send the volunteers.
Yeah. Well, and, one of those commissions, as, a lot of our Mount Vernon faithful will know, went to a certain gentleman by the name of Lawrence Washington.
Right.
So I want to
Yes.
ask who was Lawrence, because I suspect that most of our viewers and folks in this audience know exactly who Lawrence was. But what was at that sort of moment in time? Why does Lawrence want a commission, and what is he doing to get it, and sort of what was his process of induction?
Well, I think
the Army?
the Washington family had a little military history in its background to begin with. He had been educated in London, and he was available. And the idea was very interesting. If you get a regular Army commission, you get half pay for the rest of your life. So there's a financial inducement. The trick is, if you're a well-to-do country gentleman in Virginia or Pennsylvania or Rhode Island, for that matter, you can go out there and sign up 100 volunteers to fight for the king. But if you don't get that royal commission, it's up to you to pay for the subsistence and lodging of these 100 recruits who are expecting to be fed. So there is a financial risk. It doesn't come free of charge. Washington signed up volunteers here in Northern Virginia. There were 3 other volunteer officers in Virginia. There were 4 in North Carolina. Turns out there were 8 in Pennsylvania of all commonwealths to think about, which created a little different problem. The Pennsylvania legislature refused to pay a dime to support and help transport their volunteers because of the Quaker influence. But the 8 full companies, that 800 soldiers came out of Pennsylvania for this expedition. But it did work. They found the volunteers to serve as recruiting officers, and the recruiting officers had success. They signed up a bunch of people for this expedition to fight for the king in the Spanish West Indies.
And so this expedition, I mean, so we've talked a lot about the Army, which, I mean, I think we both can appreciate is the best of all possible services.
Exactly.
But they can't get to where they're going without
I can't
the
say
Navy.
that. I have a son in the
Yeah.
Navy.
But this is, this is going to be a joint operation. It's going to involve both land and sea forces. And in these sort of things, the Navy would typically be it was, essentially for British purposes, sort of the senior service. They tended to have operational control. So who's in charge of this whole thing, and have we heard of him?
Well, there are 2 people in charge, each supreme in his own domain. The naval commander was Vice Admiral of the Blue Edward Vernon, a name that might be familiar with people here, who led the initial campaign for the War of Jenkins' Ear when he captured Portobello, Panama, back in 1739. Since he was already in the West Indies, the High Command in London figured he was the sensible person to lead the naval component of this expedition. The Army commander was a favorite of the king, Major General Charles Cathcart, 8th Lord Cathcart. He was responsible for gathering up the regiments in Great Britain. His deputy was Alexander Spotswood, promoted to the rank of Major General. He was the designated commander of the American Regiment, as well as being the quartermaster general for the expedition and Cathcart's deputy. Unfortunately for Spotswood, he died during the recruiting process. So command of the American Regiment devolved on William Gooch. Is it Gooch? Is that? Yeah, it's Goochland, okay. He was the serving lieutenant governor of Virginia, who had to take a temporary leave of absence from his position here in Virginia to go on this campaign and lead the American Regiment. Back in Great Britain, he was replaced as deputy by Brigadier General Thomas Wentworth, who was a career officer, had been 25 years in the British Army, but had never been in a campaign himself. On the expedition over from Great Britain to Jamaica, which is the staging area, General Cathcart died of dysentery, along with several hundred of his soldiers just getting to Jamaica, by the way. So General Wentworth not only succeeded Spotswood as the deputy, he succeeded Cathcart as the land component commander of the expedition. So now we have a brigadier general and a vice admiral as the 2 joint commanders, one of whom was already the established British national hero, Admiral Vernon, and General Wentworth is obviously just fallen into
Just trying to do a job.
just trying to cover his bases. Turns out fairly unequal relationship, but the instructions from the High Command, from Secretary of State, was the land component and the naval component will each handle things in their own domain, and anything that requires the 2 services to work together will be sorted out in joint councils of war. Fairly reasonable solution that worked fairly well at the beginning of the expedition. Eventually came to a complete and utter breakdown. The admiral was accusing the general of deliberately sabotaging the campaign, and the general was accusing the admiral of being a traitor by the end of this expedition. So
Totally healthy command relationship.
yeah, there was no ability to work on a joint basis in the latter stages of this expedition. But initially, it worked pretty well because basically whatever Admiral Vernon wanted, General Wentworth would go along with it, till it got to a point where Wentworth realized Vernon doesn't have any idea what an army does once it gets on the ground.
Well, let's kind of get into that. We were hoping that we'd be able to throw up a big map, but we had some technical issues, so that didn't work out. So just imagine in your heads Cartagena, which I'm sure you're all well familiar with the geography of. The short version is that there is a large bay that really can only be entered through sort of one narrow pass, especially if the Spanish do their job.
Right.
And so the British are going to have, almost by definition, a series of amphibious landings to try and continue to leverage the Spanish out of these different entrenchments. So how did those? You said the first operations went well.
Right. The British campaign was to break into the outer bay through what's called Boca Chica, the narrow mouth, which is the very southern end of this bay. That was guarded by Castillo San Luis de Boca Chica. So they had to reduce a fortress. And then once they get into the outer bay, they could sail up to the mainland east of Cartagena, land there, and then approach Cartagena from the landward side, from the mainland side. Cartagena itself, by the way, sits on a very long, narrow coastal island, heavily fortified, was pretty much impervious to a direct assault, which is why the British make this indirect approach. So the British stage a landing on the island of Tierra Bamba, which is where Castillo San Luis de Boca Chica is located, and they begin a siege operation. Well, during the course of the siege, a battery on the opposite side of the channel, which was led by Jose Campuzano Polanco, the old privateer Guarda Costa, keeps firing shots across the channel into the British siege works and delaying the whole operation. So the British decide they need to take out this battery. Unfortunately, most of the British regiments are already on land in the beginning of the siege. So the only troops they had available were Americans and a small contingent of British. But they send in a raiding party at night, which is led by two people from the land force side. One is a Lieutenant James Murray, who for historians later becomes the Governor General of Canada, and Captain Lawrence Washington, leading a component of American troops. They row in behind this battery about a mile away into this narrow little bay, and just as they're about to land, two cannon shots streak right over their heads. It just so happened that the place this raiding party decided to land was where there was already an existing Spanish battery. So luckily, the troops realized that they had to assault instantly. Otherwise, if they loaded up those cannons with grape shot, so the raiding party would have been over. They stormed that battery, took it out, and then marched a mile through mangrove swamps and attacked Campuzano Polanco's battery and took it out. So this was one of the military operations where we know specifically that Lawrence Washington played an important role in. But that siege works. After about 2 weeks, the breaching battery knocks down one of the bastions of Castillo San Luis. That night, the British regulars assault it and capture it, and the Spaniards are forced to withdraw back to Cartagena. Well, once Admiral Vernon gets his ships into the outer bay, Cartagena is effectively cut off because the city is totally dependent on its outer bay for its support. Even its water comes from across the bay. So the Spaniards figured at this point they were in really deep, in deep trouble. The British land on the mainland and then proceed to maneuver against the next fortress, which is Castillo San Felipe de Barajas, which is on a hilltop just east of Cartagena. And it's the principal defensive position. Unfortunately, General Wentworth decides not to besiege Castillo San Felipe and instead assaults. Special night attack surprise, excuse me. And his tactical plans of utter failure. The British are routed from the field, in fact. And after that, Admiral Vernon refuses to reinforce them with sailors from the fleet, and they eventually have to withdraw from Cartagena.
Well, I guess, the audience may be wondering, where is the British fleet? You mentioned that they sort of help with the initial assault through the Boca Chica and then are in the Outer Bay. Where are they during this assault, and how does the relationship between the Army and the Navy just get so bad during this?
Well,
that's going to be one of the big, sort of press debates.
I think you have to look in the mindset of Admiral Vernon. While his ships, while the siege was going on at Boca Chica, his ships were out in the ocean taking a beating. Well, he was very, very frustrated by the length of the siege. And when they finally got through into the Outer Bay, he was content. My ships are safe now.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what he thought was most important, the welfare of his fleet, not necessarily the success of the expedition. So the Navy did not take an active role in trying to reduce Castillo San Felipe, which is the main fortification protecting Cartagena. He thought, well, that's the Army's business. And unfortunately, the Army was not up to the task.
Yeah. Well, and, if I remember correctly from your book, the soldiers, and we'll get back to this, but most of the soldiers that serve in the Army leave with sort of a sour impression about Admiral Vernon. So where did that sort of come from?
Well,
I'm thinking specifically like not giving them fresh water, stuff like that.
Well, they weren't aware of that at the time.
Yeah.
One of the critical shortcomings for the troops on the ground was they didn't have water. Their water had been, last time they had refreshed their water was in February, and this was now in April. Like I said, the only thing remaining in the water casks were breeding colonies of mosquitoes. So at that point, though, the British fleet had discovered a freshwater spring in the Outer Bay. But Admiral Vernon kept all the fresh water for his ships, didn't supply the Army.
Well, you mentioned about those mosquitoes. So I'm a native New Orleanian, and we despise mosquitoes for many reasons, including
They exist in Wisconsin too, by the way.
Yeah. But down in the subtropics, or especially if you're in the tropics by like Cartagena, did any of the sort of pantheon of tropical, how did sort of tropical diseases?
They're spread. The two principal ones are yellow fever and malaria. Both are spread by mosquitoes, different mosquitoes, however. The Aedes aegypti spreads yellow fever. The campaign produced an enormous number of casualties and fatalities, almost all of it due to disease. Yellow fever and malaria killed most. However, it was really the impact of scurvy that made the tropical diseases so virulent. And it's commonly thought that the Cartagena campaign failed because of yellow fever, which I don't think is accurate, because the Yellow fever was just beginning at Cartagena when General Wentworth decided he had to give up the siege and assault the Castillo. It was really scurvy and dehydration that was knocking down most of the troops at the time. And that's why they had a shortage of manpower to execute that final siege. Now, the Army and when the Navy refused to add seamen to augment the land force, the general said, well, we can't get it done. And that's when they withdrew from Cartagena. However, the withdrawal did not spare the troops. The most deaths occurred in the month after the siege was lifted, oddly enough. And it affected the ships as well, because many of the crews on the Navy ships died from yellow fever on the way back to Jamaica. So it was one of the tragedies here that, and ironies, is that the British gave up the siege at Cartagena because they thought they didn't have enough men and to spare any more losses to tropical illnesses. In the end, it didn't save their troops anyway. Men died. It's just that they didn't have a victory to go with it.
So what we talked a little bit about Lawrence's service in that specific raid. What else was? We obviously have an outsized interest in Lawrence here.
Sure.
What else was? What else was involved in Lawrence's war?
Well, after the British expedition withdrew from Cartagena, they still had an enormous fleet at their disposal and a large land force. So they looked around for another objective and they picked Santiago de Cuba. The problem with this campaign was Admiral Vernon was not going to risk his ships to try and attack the fortress at the entrance to Santiago. And he wasn't about to let his ships sit out in the ocean again to get beat up while the army conducted a siege. So the admiral landed the army in Guantanamo Bay. Now, anybody familiar with the geography of Cuba? Guantanamo is not sitting next to Santiago. It's about 45 to 50 miles away. And of course, the army didn't have any draft animals, so that meant that they would have to drag all the cannon and ammunition 45 to 50 miles through wild country. Wasn't going to happen. But when they got into Guantanamo Bay, they had to do some reconnaissance. They didn't know where did we go to get a road to get to Santiago. What's the land like? So they landed a force off of the admiral's flagship, which was commanded by Lawrence Washington. And a component of his company did the first reconnaissance inland from Guantanamo Bay. So if anybody asks you who is the first American Marine to land at Guantanamo Bay, the answer is Lawrence Washington.
Which is full of fun facts.
Yeah.
So would you say that Lawrence and Admiral Vernon had or how would you describe the nature of Lawrence and Admiral Vernon's relationship?
Well, it appears to be positive. Vernon serves. His flagship is where Washington and his company, part of his company, is quartered. They fill in for missing sailors. So he was obviously rubbing elbows with Admiral Vernon throughout this campaign. I don't think there's any existing literature or any writing to indicate that a specific attitude that he might have had to Admiral Vernon, other than the fact that he was very happy to be serving on the admiral's flagship as opposed to some smaller ship. And it would appear that Admiral Vernon thought fairly highly of Washington because he had used Washington on a couple of special expeditions. So I would presume that the relationship was favorable, but I can't attest to it specifically.
And he, either named or kept his house named after the good admiral. So that's something. I don't, no offense, Doug. I don't think I'm going to name my house after you. Mount Bradburn is a little, for me to do that would be a little pretentious.
Well, do keep in mind that Admiral Vernon was the British national hero of the time. He was extremely popular, even after this expedition completely fell apart, in which I believe that he bears significant responsibility. He remains very popular, and he's got a tomb in Westminster. So apparently the British still thought fairly highly of him.
Well, I'm just sort of in with, because we'll let the audience have a crack at you here, but I just wanted to end with, I thought it was really fascinating when you and I were sort of doing the pre-interview for this, when you talked about why you so much wanted to do a talk about your book here and discuss it here. And would you like to share with the rest of the class?
This is the place, the venue for discussing the expedition to the West Indies. Because this is, to my knowledge, the only place that has any type of a memorial or connection to the Americans who served on this expedition. Over 4,000 colonists served in the Spanish West Indies in 1741 and 42. That's a pretty significant number of American soldiers. 2,400 of them died in this expedition. And I think Mount Vernon is the only place left with any type of connection to these people in America.
So there you go. See, we do good work here. Okay, well, so while we get sort of, if there's any questions from the online crowd, please submit them in the chat box, and they will get those to me. But we're going to give first dibs to the folks that are here in person because you came in person, so you
clap so loudly.
You clap so loudly. So, any questions from the audience?
Please.
And they have a mic, so just.
What effect did this disaster have on recruiting in America for the 7 Years' War, French and Indian War?
In a word, a lot. I think if there's anything that American colonists learned from this expedition is you don't volunteer for the British Army. Do keep in mind, plenty of American colonists signed up to serve in the King George's War, as we call it, and in the French and Indian War. But they served under colonial militia. They were regiments raised in each of the colonies, and they served with their local militia officers. There was an attempt to raise a British Army regiment called the Royal Americans in the French and Indian War. Half of that regiment came from Europe. There was nothing ever approaching the enthusiasm or the scale of the recruiting program for the British Army that occurred for this expedition in 1741. So it soured colonists on ever serving in the British Army.
You mentioned that there was a big leap in sort of British ability in these kinds of operations later on, the 7 Years' War. Was any of that, are any officers in Cartagena involved in those later operations? Is this direct personal experience of what not to do? Or sort of, the word gets spread?
There were a few, but do keep in mind, 2/3 of the British soldiers died on this expedition as well, with a huge number of Americans who died. So not a lot of survivors to go around. I mentioned Lieutenant James Murray, who later ends up becoming General James Murray. There are a few others. Matter of fact, one of the Americans came back in the French and Indian War, John Winslow, but not too many. It was a fairly negative experience for everybody concerned, including the British. I can't give you any itemized list of the figures of the British officers. General Wolfe's father served on this campaign, but he didn't serve after that. No, really, not many, to be honest.
Okay, so we have a question from online. Linda asks, not sure from where, were there any American men who were forced into service for the expedition?
Yes. It wasn't like the Navy where they had impressment, where you literally got bound and gagged and thrown in a ship. But in Virginia, for instance, there was a law that if you didn't have any land, property, or visible means of employment, you could be inducted, so to speak, into the British Army, which led to some complaints amongst the British officers that too many of the soldiers from Virginia were suspect, and including a lot of, quote, Irish papists, which wasn't going well with the British Army at the time. Which led to, as a little anecdote, Lawrence Washington, after Cartagena, put his name in to become a recruiting officer to go back to the colonies to help recruit more soldiers for the extended campaign. But General Wentworth said, no, we're not interested in more soldiers from Virginia or North Carolina. So he didn't get the recruiting post.
In 1950, Albert Harkness put out an article, Americanism in Jenkins' Year, that's much discussed. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the role of the Americans serving as, quote, Americans?
Yes, this expedition is considered to be the first time in which the term Americans is popularized. Prior to that, colonists were identified as provincials. And throughout the campaign, there was no question that the British called the Gooch's regiment Americans, and all the Americans called the British regulars Europeans. And that separate identity was held intact throughout the campaign. As another fact here, most of the American soldiers spent their time on the expedition serving on Admiral Vernon's ships, with the exception of a few times where there was active campaigning on land. So the experience of most of the American soldiers was being treated as a swabby on a British warship, outranked by every British seaman or sailor, told what to do. So it was a pretty poor experience. Now, Harkness makes a claim that this was kind of the seeds of the revolution, that the mistreatment of the Americans on board the ship throughout the whole campaign led to resentment, leading eventually to the Revolutionary War. I think that's a bit of a stretch, to be honest with you. I think after this campaign, the American colonists are still loyal British subjects. However, they are no longer fans of ever serving in the British Army or the Royal Navy. Oh, really? Excellent.
Well, and to that, or to piggyback off that, Tori online asks, why would George Washington want to be under British control after Lawrence's experiences?
Well, it's one thing to be in the British Army, subject to British High Command, and being treated like a red-haired stepchild, versus serving the king. Again, I maintain that the colonists were still loyal British subjects and thought highly of the monarch, and certainly wanted to serve the kingdom. So they're certainly loyal in that respect, especially when it comes to fighting Spaniards or the French in Canada. So yes, certainly they're eager to serve. George Washington, during the French and Indian War, obviously sought to get preferment or get recognized as a British regular officer, as his brother, or his half-brother, had done, unsuccessfully, by the way. The British general refused to give him rank in the British Army, so he remained a militia officer.
Just as you had said, the British learned lessons that they then applied later on when they invaded Cuba, with their conflict with Cuba. Did the Americans who participated in the War of Jenkins' era have any kind of lessons that they passed on that were then used when the Americans prosecuted the Revolutionary War against Britain? Or was it just too much time in between?
A couple things. I'd have to say, in answer to your question, probably not. A couple things that work here. One, not many survived. Colonel Gooch was asked by the king to serve in King George's War, to form another American regiment to attack Canada. And Gooch turned him down and said, no, I'm not physically able to do it. And he said, you don't expect to have anybody from the last expedition to step up and volunteer to fight again, because the experience was so negative from the American perspective. I think from a tactical standpoint, there were certainly military lessons probably absorbed by Americans who returned to militia regiments after this campaign. And then there was a successful siege operation conducted at Louisbourg in Cape Breton Island in just a few years later, which much better cooperation with the Navy in that example. But the British Army and the British Royal Navy did take a few lessons to heart. And I specifically cited the example in Havana in 1762. If you look at, those commanders were keenly aware of the failures in Cartagena. The British Army conducted a siege operation, saw it through all the way, did not try and launch a surprise night attack. They had to deal with the tropical disease, lost many soldiers to tropical disease. The admiral from the fleet backfilled those people with sailors to augment the land force, and they continued the siege, knocked down the bastion at El Morro, and successfully assaulted it and captured Havana. Did it right by the book of how to conduct a siege operation. Great cooperation between the Navy and the Army. However, one lesson that didn't get learned in the 18th century was that the joint land-sea operations still had separate supreme commanders. And it's really not to World War II with the influence of General Eisenhower to have a unified, combined commander over land, sea, and Eisenhower's case, air forces for a theater. That's a lesson that went a long time, because the Navy had its way of doing things, the Army had its way of doing things, and never the twain shall meet except on an amphibious operation.
Or football field.
Or football field, yeah. At any rate, it took a long time for military jealousies to be put aside to name one person in charge.
One more?
As you suggested, the training may have been a bit different. Militias in this country as opposed to the regulars. How was that integrated, if at all, and was that one of the major weak spots in executing Cartagena?
Is that you, Scott?
Pardon me?
That's Scott?
No,
Oh, okay, you look like somebody I know.
I'm sorry, I'm Navy.
Training is a great topic. The American regiment they're American companies, by the way, scattered from Boston Common all the way down to the Cape Fear River in North Carolina. Got about 4, maybe 5 weeks of training total. They got that in the summer of 1740. Got packed up onto transport ships, sent to Jamaica. Well, they got into Jamaica, never got off ship until the main body arrived in January. Got to do one parade for the commanding general, who dismissed them as a fighting force, and they went from there onto the warships to backfill missing sailors. That was the extent of the training of the American regiment. Needless to say, they were little better than an untrained force. They had never had an opportunity to train as a battalion. The biggest formations they had was a company size unit for training. So they probably learned the evolutions of how to fire, move, and fire by platoon, but never as a large scale unit. And hence, when they were actually used on land as a fighting force, they were used as skirmishers or for reconnaissance missions in Cuba, where it didn't matter if they didn't know how to march as a file and do proper parade ground tactics, because they were running through the countryside, which seemed like the Americans did okay doing that. But training was a real shortfall of the American regiment in the War of Jenkins' Ear.
All right, well, Mr. Chapman will be doing book signing outside. Thank you all for coming. If you have some more questions, I know he'd be happy to answer them.
Sure.
Out there. For those of you online, thank you for joining, and to everyone, good night and have a pleasant day, or where, for the online crowd, pleasant day. I don't know where you are. Thank you all for coming out and watching.
Thank you. That's good. Very much appreciate it.